Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of How the Story Ends. Sorry, I'm a little bit hyped up this morning. My wife made chocolate chip muffins, and they were really, really good. And so, yeah, riding a little bit of a sugar high this morning. But I'm excited to talk with you about our study of the book of Revelation and really how the story of the Bible comes to an end and some of those key important ideas. And so we've been looking in the book of Revelation the last several weeks, and I'm not going to try to recap everything we've looked at because you can just go back and watch the earlier videos. But in chapters 4 and 5 of Revelation, we have finally gotten a look into heaven, and we've seen a person sitting on a throne, and we've seen how all of heaven, all of the creatures in heaven are organized around this throne and are focused on the person who is seated on the throne, and their focus is worship because this person on the throne is worthy. They keep saying over and over, he's worthy of worship and praise and glory and majesty, and they just can't wait to express that whatever way that they can. Then you come to chapter 5, which is what we looked at last week, and we have another figure who is worthy of praise and worship and honor and glory. And this is not the one seated on the throne. This is a lion who actually takes the form of a lamb. A lion who has conquered, who is also the lamb who was slain. And this person who obviously is connected to and is a symbol of Jesus Christ and his life and his ministry and his death and his resurrection, he also now is going to step onto the scene, and he is going to take a scroll out of the hand of the one who's seated on the throne, and he's about to start opening up that scroll. Now, in the scroll, what is the scroll? The scroll is basically it's the script for the rest of the story. It's the script for how the story is going to end. It's the script that's going to lay out the final steps in the process of tying up all the loose ends of history. And the Lamb, who is worthy because he died and shed his blood for humanity and has rescued some of humanity to form a kingdom out of them, he has the right now to bring human history to its appropriate conclusion. And now we're about to get into the hard, hot and heavy part of the book of Revelation that tends to draw so much attention because stuff just starts blowing up. Crazy stuff starts happening. Things that you can't even really imagine now are going to start to become a reality. And it's going to start hitting the ground pretty quick, and they're going to start running right here in Revelation chapter 6. So today, what I want to do is take a look at the first set of judgments that God drops on humanity as the human story is coming to a conclusion. Basically, this scroll is sealed with 7 seals. And these 7 seals, each one of them, as the Lamb opens that seal and opens the scroll up further, it unleashes into the world certain activities. And as we go, I want to take a look at those seals, what they represent, what do they mean, what's going to be happening on earth while this is happening in heaven. And we're going to try to make sense of Revelation chapters 6 and 7 over the next couple of weeks of videos here. And before I dive into Revelation chapter 6, I just want to remind you on our church website, fbchh.org, if you go on the resources tab and go about halfway down, you'll see ABF notes. We should have brand new notes for this week. The title is The Seals Are Opened. So when you open up your document, if you see the title, The Seals Are Opened, you know you're on the right thing. And these notes are going to be good for the next 2 weeks worth of videos. So you don't need to keep looking each week for brand new stuff. We're going to be working off of these notes for the next couple of sessions that I'm with you, okay? So let me just dive into Revelation chapter 6. So open up your copy of the Bible to Revelation chapter 6. And before we actually look at the text, there's a couple of introductory comments that will help us to remember some important principles for understanding what we're about to see. Okay, because we can't just assume that we can just jump into the middle of it and not kind of follow along where John has been taking us. Going all the way back to chapter 1 of Revelation, I wanted to point out to you guys something that's really important, and that is the concept of a vantage point, okay? A vantage point is the spot from which you are looking at something, right? So if you're hunting, you want to get a vantage point on your whole region so that you can see the animals coming out of the brush or coming out of the woods or going across the meadow so that you can get a good shot, right? Like, I'm not a hunter, but that's what I imagine, is you climb up into one of these blinds, or you climb up into one of these tree, up in the tree, not a tree fort, you know what I mean. Just up there, you want a specific vantage point so that you can see from a different perspective. Because when you're on the ground, you're limited in what you can see or how far you can see or depth perception. So your vantage point is very, very important. Where you look at something from will determine how much you see and how much you understand. Well, the thing is very true also in any kind of literature. Whenever you read a book, you should be asking, whose vantage point am I looking from? Which character is showing me this story through their eyes? Because it's going to make a difference. If there's a story about a husband and a wife, and the story is told from the wife's perspective, you're going to get a very different feel than if the same story is told from the husband's perspective. And so when it comes to Scripture, especially the narratives in Scripture, vantage point is also very, very important. And sometimes in the middle of it, it shifts from one to the other, as it's going to today. But where does it start? Where is the vantage point that we're starting with in Revelation chapter 6. Now, I just want to point this out, and then we'll kind of look into the details. Your first set of blanks here on the notes on page 40 is, or not 40, I think you guys are on page 38, 37, something like that. We need to remember, here's the first set of blanks, the heavenly vantage point for these judgments. So the vantage point is not the vantage point from earth, it's the vantage point from heaven. Next phrase here. What John sees is what these events look like from God's perspective, not from the security camera footage of earth. And you remember, I already talked about this distinction. Security camera footage is just like what's going on right in front of my eyes. What's right in front of me, that's the security camera footage. No, there's just, all you can see is what's right there in front of your eyes. The details that are right in front of you. God's vantage point, though, is going to look at that exact same situation with a different set of eyes. He's going to see and notice things that we don't notice because we're right down here in the middle of all the action. So what we see here in these seals, as these seals are opened up and as things start to happen on the earth, we are getting John's perspective from heaven looking down on those things. We are not seeing it the way the people who lived on earth would see it. Now, a little bit later on, it's going to shift. It's going to shift to the perspective of people on the earth. But for now, this is the perspective from heaven. A couple of subpoints here I want to talk about. The unpleasant things that follow, and there will be a lot of unpleasant things that are going to follow from here on out, might seem like Satan, that's the blank, Satan has gained the upper hand and is forcing his way onto the stage of history, but that is a lie. Okay? Let me just explain. Look at verse 1, just verse 1. Verse 1 says, "Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say, with a voice like thunder, 'Come.' And I looked, and behold, a white horse. And its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer." Now, we'll talk about what that means in just a minute, but the thing I want to point out to you is, who is the person that is doing the actions that are happening here? Is Satan forcing his way into the story? Is Satan forcing his way onto the stage to say, "Hey God, you've had the attention long enough. I'm going to bring my conqueror out and I'm going to conquer this world, and this is the time when I shine because I'm calling the shots. I'm Satan and I'm winning." Is that the way this is happening, or is it the exact opposite? Is it that the Lamb is the one who is actively bringing these things about? It's not Satan asserting his power over the world and saying, "Wow, I guess nobody can stop me. I think I'm going to destroy the earth now." It's the Lamb who's opening the seals. When the Lamb is done opening the seal, one of the living creatures yells out, "Come." And then this white rider appears, okay? So everything that happens to follow. And we have all kinds of stuff. We have political upheaval, we have war, there's chaos, there's famine, there's death, there's widespread persecution. All of this is going to happen in these first few seals. As all that is happening, It is not Satan who has grabbed control of the story and is now wrecking everything. It is God unfolding even these chaotic things, even these upsetting, disturbing things are a part of his plan for how this world is going to end. Okay, that's the next blank here. Everything that comes is sent from the Lamb, who is actively bringing history to its rightful and just conclusion. Its rightful and just conclusion. The Lamb is still in charge. The Lamb is in control. No matter how chaotic things seem like on earth, no matter how horrible things look like from the security camera footage, there is a God in heaven who is opening the seals, and he is the one bringing these things about, and therefore he has his hand on the thermostat. He knows what's going on. If the heat gets up too high, he's going to turn it down. If it's too low, he's going to turn it up. He is in charge, even if it seems like Satan is running amok on planet Earth. Now, we need to remember this as we enter into an election season that is very contentious and where we feel like life could change pretty dramatically for us in the next year or two, depending on which way this election goes. Okay? Please, I beg of you, maintain the perspective that says, I know things look chaotic down here on earth, and if one person gets elected, this is going to be bad. And if the other person gets elected, there's probably going to be other things that are going to be bad. And either way, we're tempted to want to think that Satan is winning, that he's gaining control, that he is somehow forcing his way onto the stage and taking over for God. And what a terrible world we live in, and we can lament how sin is running rampant and Satan gets to do whatever he wants. I'm sorry, that's not how the story goes. There's a God in heaven. He has his hand on the wheel. He's got his hand on the thermostat. He's opening the seals. He's in charge of how this whole thing plays out. And even though it feels chaotic, when you look at it from the vantage point of heaven, which is the point, right? That's why we're being told the story from the vantage point of heaven. John could have told us all this same information just talking about events on earth. He could have done the security camera approach, but he didn't. He took the heavenly vantage point, or God gave him a heavenly vantage point so that we could see things from God's perspective, because we need to always remember, in the middle of our chaos, God is in control. In the middle of things that seem to be not going our way, God is still in charge. God is still running things. God hasn't forgotten how to run the universe. So we need to just calm down a little bit. We need to realize that no matter what comes our way, and there may be big challenges coming our way, that God is the one that is moving those events along, and therefore whatever comes, we accept from his hand. We don't freak out. We don't fall down on the pavement and look up to the sky and shake our fist and scream about the fact that maybe things didn't go the way we wanted. We have to accept what comes as from him. And I think that's one of the most important points of the book of Revelation, is say, look, you need to see things from my perspective. And that leads me to the next point here. Okay, this reality, this vantage point issue, explains why we have the book of Revelation in the first place. And this is going to maybe be a little bit mind-bending for you, but here we go. God wants the believers of that time to interpret, that's the blank you can fill in, to interpret the events they are living through the way he wants them to. Now, there's a couple things in that sentence that I think should become important if you think about them a little bit. And I hope you'll think about them with me for just a moment. First of all, I believe the primary purpose of the book of Revelation is written for the believers who are going through the events listed in this book. Not us. Not us. Not even the first century, second, third, fourth, fifth, any of the centuries in between. No matter how bad the persecution has gotten in the life of the church over the course of the church age, there's not going to be any kind of tribulation or persecution that rivals what's going to happen during the generation that these things take place. And I happen to believe, and maybe I'm in the minority on this, and you can fact check me and check with other pastors, and you can disagree with me if you like, that's fine. But I believe primarily the book of Revelation was written not for us who live in the in-between times, but it's written to be there already in print, so that when believers during this era are trying to figure out what in the world is going on in their world, they have a guide to help them figure out how to respond properly to the challenges that they face. You catch me? So in other words, I think when Jesus gave this to John, he was primarily saying, John, I want you to write down everything that you're going to write down to help out the people who are alive during these events. Now, to John didn't know what generation that was going to be. It's possible it could have happened in his lifetime. It could have happened in the lifetime of the next generation, or the next, or the next. And turns out it's been several generations. Dozens of generations have gone by without these events taking place. And there's a future generation that's going to come someday that's going to be living through these experiences. And I think, honestly, this actually helps me understand, or at least come to grips with, the book of Revelation, and also the information that Jesus gives in Matthew 24 and 25 that we already talked about, where he talks about the end times and he talks about the timing of everything. Some of the details in that seem pretty hard to understand. Like, there's some dead ends in the book of Revelation that I'm probably not going to call too much attention to, because it's kind of embarrassing to stand in front of the camera and go, I have no idea what he's talking about here. I have no idea what he's referring to. Okay, let me give you an example. We'll talk about this probably when the time comes a little bit later on. We'll talk about the mark of the beast. Okay, the mark of the beast. The beast, turns out, is a world leader who's going to rise up, that Satan is going to rise up and empower. And this world leader is going to be the person who spearheads the persecution and all the horrible things that are going to happen to Christians and Jews during the time of the tribulation. This beast is going to do that. You may have heard of a figure called the Antichrist, which I doubt he'll go by that title, like on the security camera stuff, because nobody wants to be known as the Antichrist. But he is going to function as a figure like Jesus, who is actually opposed to everything Jesus stood for, but who has the power and the authority that they want, at least, the power and authority that Jesus had. Okay, so this beast appears, and somehow he is going to devise a way of being able to tell who are his followers versus who are the followers of God, because he wants to figure out who are the people he can kill or should kill. He has his sights set on eliminating the Jews and eliminating the Christians. He has a plan. And so he comes up with this thing called the mark of the beast, and there's some hints about what it's involved. It seems to be some kind of an economic thing, some kind of a rite of passage, or some identification thing, so that you can actually purchase food and stuff like that. And again, we don't know all the details of it, but you know what? Some of it, and then it talks about the mark of the beast, and then it says it's number 666, right? You've heard that? And then it says, let me just read it, because it's really interesting. Let's see if I can find it. See, this is why you should stick to your notes. If you're ever in a position where you have to read, to teach, especially something complicated, just stick to your notes. Don't do what I'm doing right now. Okay, here we go. Verse 16. Revelation 13, verse 15. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak, and might cause those who do not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That is, the name of the beast, or the number of its name. This calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. And ever since then, I wish I could tell you how many trees have been killed to produce paper, to put ink on, so that people living in the in-between eras, going all the way back to the Middle Ages, speculate about what this 666 might refer to, and what it might be, and what it might mean, and how you might be able to figure this out. But honestly, and this is the truth, okay? I promise you, I'm not hiding anything from you, some secret that I'm not willing to reveal. There is no indication in Scripture anywhere of what that means. And certainly, there's no sense of what it's going to look like on the security camera level, right? If you're just walking around living life during the tribulation, the number 666 somehow is going to be marked on your hand or your forehead, but it's not going to look exactly like that. They're probably going to disguise it or hide it or make it look like something different because they don't want to connect to this. Here's my point. My point is this. That detail might make a ton of sense to the people living during that time who are looking at the security camera footage and notice the way the beast or the world leader is organizing this thing and what he's calling people to do. In the time that it's taking place, the people who read it during that generation might go, oh my gosh, I noticed that from this other commercial, or I saw this from the poster that's promoting this thing, or I saw this because my boss came and talked to me about this, or my neighbor, or maybe the police came and talked to me about this. They're going to have access to information we don't have access to because we're not living through those times. And I think that's just an illustration of my belief that this particular book was written primarily to meet the needs of the generation living through these events. Now, please don't misunderstand me. That doesn't mean that there's not applicable truth in the book of Revelation that applies to us today, say when we're going through persecution or when we're going through hard times. No, frankly, the book of Revelation has a ton of content that I need as a 21st century American Christian. But I'm just saying, I believe that some of the reasons why all the pieces don't totally connect is because we are missing out on the security camera footage of the end times. And it doesn't make as much sense, but it will make more sense to the people who live during that time. I mean, John even says it. This is talking about the mark of the beast. He says, this is going to require wisdom. He says, let him who has understanding calculate this. Well, everybody's been trying for centuries to calculate it, and nobody's come up with a good explanation for it. So I think that means there's going to be people during the era of the end times that are going to read this, and they will have other information we don't have, and they'll be able to calculate it and figure out exactly how they're supposed to either avoid this mark or resist it in whatever way they're supposed to, that God wants them to. At least recognize it for what it is. And maybe we don't have access to all that information, and that's okay. Maybe it wasn't written for us directly, and that's okay. And maybe we might have to come to the end of our study of Revelation and say, you know what? There's pieces of this that we may never understand. Now, that might frustrate you or me, and that's fine. We can be frustrated about it, but we have to accept it. The Bible was not always written directly to us. It wasn't always written directly for us. Even the parts that are not written directly for us, we can learn from it. We can learn and get to know our God through it. We can see His glory revealed in it, and that can change our lives. But that doesn't mean every line on every page is written for you. It's just not. It just wasn't. And the sooner we accept that, I think, the better. Now, I do want to help you understand this. And then the second part of this is the interpretation thing. This is something that revolutionized the way I thought about God and the way I've thought about truth going back a few years ago. Let me try to explain this. Okay, so when something happens to you in your life, it's just a thing. It's just a circumstance that happens, all right? Let me give you an example. So you're driving along the highway. All of a sudden, somebody runs you off the road. I'm not talking about they cut you off and you honk at them and you had to put on the brakes. Like, they literally drive up next to you, they look in your window, and then they do this with the steering wheel and force you off the road, right? You go down off the road, down the ditch, and you are spitting mad. First of all, your family could have been injured. Luckily, nobody was. Everybody's wearing their seatbelt, and you were able to hit the brakes, and so you kind of roll down in. But you get a flat tire. You know, there's something wrong in the engine. There's like, you know, some kind of steam coming out of your engine, and you're just mad. Okay, this person just totally messed with your car and totally ruined your plans for the day. You were going to go up to the museum, you were going to go to the zoo, you were going to go to the park, you had a big plan with your family, and now this person, this idiot, driving in his car, he ruined it. if you're sitting in the ditch angry at that person, the reason you're angry is because you have interpreted that event to mean something, right? You experienced the event knocked you off the road and canceled your day's plans, and now you've got to fix your car. And you got to figure out how to get your family in a tow truck to a place to repair it, all that stuff. It's annoying the life out of you, okay? But the reason you're mad is because you've interpreted what that person did in a way that's negative. You say, you know what? That person was trying to hurt me. That person was trying to ruin me. That person was selfish. That person has some desire to hurt me for some reason I don't understand. That's a bad person. This is a bad event. And here I am in the ditch, and I've got all this work I got to do now, and I am mad because this was horrible that this happened to me. Well, that's an interpretation of the event. The event is just what happened. And then there's how you take what happened and you choose to feel and to think a certain way based on how you understand what that event means. Now, suppose something else happened. And those of you that love conspiracy theories are going to love this. Suppose you're driving along and the person comes alongside of you and all of a sudden you're not in your car, you're in their car. You're in the car of the person who's forcing you off the road. And you realize that this person in the other car is a spy. He's a secret government official, and he knows that there's a bomb in your engine. And if you get above a certain mile per hour, that bomb is going to explode, and it's going to kill you and everybody in your car, right? Now, he doesn't have time to roll his window down, have you roll your window down, and while you're both going down the highway, probably accelerating towards that horrible number that's going to cause the explosion, he doesn't have time to slowly explain to you everything that he's about to do. All he knows is he's got to stop your car from accelerating because at 65 miles an hour, your car will blow up and everybody inside is going to die. So he's like, what can I do? What can I do? I know what I'll do. I'll force him off the road and force him to not be able to get up to that 65 mark so the bomb doesn't explode and his family doesn't die. You with me? So he forces you off the road. Now, let me ask you this question. Suppose you're in the car that's in the side of the road. How does it change your perspective if you know his motivation for why he did what he did? If all of a sudden you realize, oh my word, he wasn't trying to hurt me, he was trying to save my life. Because if I accelerated to 66 miles an hour, my whole family was going to die, my car was going to explode. He caused me great inconvenience, yes. But he inconvenienced me to try to protect me from damaging and destroying my family as a whole. Your interpretation of the events is going to cause you to feel and think differently about your circumstances. All of a sudden, you're in the ditch thanking God that he got to you in time before you hit mile 66 an hour and before your car exploded. You're going to turn around and put your hand on your children's faces and just be like, thank God that they're safe. You're going to reach over to your spouse and you're going to be like, honey, I'm so glad that you're okay. I'm so glad he pushed us over into the ditch before it was too late. Why? Because you've chosen to change your interpretation to interpret your events through the perspective of the other person instead of yourself. I hope that makes sense to describe how God wants us to see life. Things happen to us. Our church has experienced some really difficult things over the last 6 weeks. Events have happened, and these events demand an interpretation. We have to look at these events and we can do one of two things. For example, we can look at all the events that have been difficult for our church over the last 6 weeks and we can say, you know what? I know why this happened. This happened because God is displeased with our church. We've sinned in some way and God is angry with us and God is punishing us because we didn't do enough of this or we didn't do enough of that. or because maybe we're sinning in some area. I know God's angry. That's why all this stuff has happened. You're giving your interpretation of the event, and that interpretation is now going to dictate your actions from here on out. If you think God is angry with you, then you're going to cower before God and try to get God back on your good side. If, however, there's something else going on that you don't know about, it should change the way you interpret the events and the circumstances, and it should change the way you feel about those events. Classic illustration of this is Job. Okay? Job suffers greatly. He loses all of his possessions, he loses his family, his kids, all 10 of them die in one fell swoop. Like, can you imagine getting that news? Not just that one family member has died, but that 10 of your children, all 10 of your kids are gone, snuffed out in a moment. I mean, how horrifying must that have been? And Job, over time, comes to become very angry and bitter that God allowed these things to happen to him. He interprets those events as God is trying to hurt me, God is being unjust, God is being unfair. Why is God picking on me? I'm one of the good guys. This is not right. This is not fair. God, you're not just. God, I'm mad at you. That is how he responds to the events of God allowing these things into his life. But here's the thing. If you read the first 2 chapters of the book of Job, you as the reader get to find out something that Job himself never understood, is that the reason that Job loses everything is because God is trying to defend his own honor and reveal his character to the world as being a God who is worthy of love and trust, even when he doesn't bless us with all the good things we want. It's easy to praise God when he gives you everything that you want. How hard is it to bless God when he takes something away from you that you want? He takes something away from you that you love. He takes something away from you that you need. And God sets this up with the adversary to prove to the world, to the watching invisible world, that he is a God worth worshiping and worth loving, even when he takes away things that we love and need and want. Now, if Job had have known that that was going on, don't you think it would have changed his perspective on his situation? Because Job came to have a bad interpretation of these events. And it led to a bad result in Job's life. And when God shows up, God has to rebuke Job for his attitude towards him, because he had interpreted things wrongly. So here's the point I'm trying to make about the book of Revelation. God writes the book of Revelation for a generation of people who are stuck in the middle of the most crazy, chaotic, terrifying, dangerous, scary 7-year period of human history that has ever existed. I mean, they don't know which end is up. They don't know who to trust. They don't know who to believe. They know they have to hide their identity as Christians because people are hunting them down to kill them. Okay, this is a scary, scary time. And if you live during that time period, you could look at your circumstances and say, God's angry with us. God's trying to destroy us. We must have failed God. There must be something wrong here. Satan is winning. Why is Satan winning? He shouldn't be winning. God is supposed to be winning. And so the book of Revelation was written for those people as they're hiding with their families to be able to look at this text and say, no, that's not what's happening at all. That's not what is actually going on. You need to interpret these events that you are seeing in the security camera footage of life. Interpret these events through the grid of what is true. I want you to see it from my perspective so that you know no matter what it looks like on earth, no matter what you're tempted to believe based on what you see, this is what is true. The Lamb is the one who is opening these things up. God is still in control. Satan is not running wild and unrestrained throughout the world. God still is bringing this about. And God wants the people living during that time to interpret their events trusting from his vantage point that he knows what he's doing. So that when they're in jail for their faith and awaiting execution, they're not sitting there going, what's going to happen to my family? And what's going to happen to the earth? And is Satan going to win? He doesn't want them worried about whether or not Satan is going to win. He wants them to know while they're in that same cell, facing that exact same execution, that really even their death is going to lead us closer to the end when the king is crowned and his name is Jesus. He wants them to sit in that jail cell confident that no matter what happens to them, the universe is in good hands and it's working towards its ultimate conclusion. God wants us to interpret the events of our lives from his perspective, not just from our limited perspective. And even though that's going to be more appropriate for the people living through the events of Revelation, that is true for us today. Friends, we've got to look at the things that are going on with COVID. We've got to look at the things going on with this crazy election that's happening right now. We've got to look at the things that are going on in our church with some of the tough times we've been going through lately. We've got to look at those events through the grid of, how is God looking at this? What has God said about appointing of kings and rulers on the earth? What has God said about what a Christian's responsibility is to live even under hostile governments that are trying to deliberately hurt us? There's a lot of information in Scripture from giving God's perspective on these matters. And we need to embrace that and not just get into this terrified, maybe it's because God's not winning. Maybe it's because God doesn't care. Maybe it's because God's not strong enough. We can't allow our limited perspective to determine how we interpret these events. We've got to interpret them from God's perspective. Okay? So I know that's a long diversion to point out this important truth. But the seals are pretty straightforward. So let's just talk about those right now, okay? I'm going to look at seals 1, 2, 3, and 4 together. You may notice on your sheet that I have like a little box to talk about the first 4 seals, because here's the first blank here, and I'll actually give this to you before we start reading. These first 4 seals are meant to be understood together. There's a similarity in the way they're described. There's a similarity in imagery. It's horsemen, okay? A seal gets open, we already read it, and there's a white horse and a rider. Then the second one is there's a red horse and a rider. The third one, there's a black horse and a rider. And then there's seal 4, a pale horse and a rider. So these 4 these 4 seals are meant to be understood sort of as a unit, okay? And they happen, I think, pretty quickly and sequentially. In fact, I think from the security camera perspective, I think these 4 seals are literally happening at the same time, chronologically, all right? And let me try to explain what I mean. Take a look at verse 1 again of chapter 6. Now I watched when the Lamb opened one of the 7 seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures say with a voice like thunder, "Come!" And I looked, and behold, a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he came out conquering and to conquer. Verse 3, when he opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, "Come!" And out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. Verse 5, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come!" And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and its rider had a pair of scales in his hand, and I heard what seemed to be a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." Verse 7, when he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with the sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. So what are these seals describing? The second point here under seals 1 through 4 is this. These seals describe 2 words I want you to write down. General conditions on earth during the early days of the tribulation, okay? Early days of the tribulation. You remember we talked about in the book of Daniel, there's 70 periods of 7 years that God has determined for Israel. The first 69 have already happened, and then there's a gap, and then there's going to be another set of 7 years where God sort of wraps up the story of Israel and of human history. This is that period of time. We also call it, I'm going to refer to it very often as the tribulation period, because it's a time of great testing and trial and persecution here on earth, okay? So when I talk about the tribulation, I'm talking about that 7-year period of time Daniel talked about as the 70th week of years that still have to do with God's working with the nation of Israel, okay? And these first 4 seals describe the general conditions on earth during the early days of that time. So probably in that first half, in the first 3.5 years, we're describing these general conditions. Now, what are the general conditions? Take a look at this box or this chart or this table that I have here. And there's seal 1, seal 2, seal 3, seal 4. And you see that they're labeled with white horse, red horse, black horse, pale horse. Now, just again, a description of the rider. Every single one of these is repeated, and there's a description of the rider himself, okay? And the first rider says he has, in verse 2, its rider had a bow, okay? So a bow implies a bow and arrows. This is a horseman. These are the lethal conquering forces of their day. If you have cavalry in the ancient world, you have a leg up over infantry, right? It's always been that way. That's why tanks became such a big deal in World War I, because people are there in their holes with their guns, and then all of a sudden you have this plated monstrosity that is literally driving down into your hole, and you can't destroy it, but it can destroy you. Well, people who have had a height advantage and a speed advantage have always had an advantage over infantry over the course of human history. It's sort of like a of warfare just in general. And so here he is, he's on a horse and he has a bow. So and it says he was given a crown. A crown represents authority, right? Being a king, you have the authority to do certain things. So he has a bow, he's given a crown, and he goes forth to conquer. That's what he's doing. Now, what am I describing? I think that's describing this world leader that we're going to talk about later that I refer to as the beast. There is going to be a figure who is going to arise, and he is going to be a conqueror. There's going to be conquering of nations. There's going to be what I'm calling, in fact, the 2 blanks at the bottom of that little section is political upheaval. Political upheaval. There's going to be a lot of chaos. Jesus describes in Matthew 24, nation is going to rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there's going to be all kinds of conflicts, and there's going to be this figure who is riding out across the whole earth, and he's been given authority, and he is going to seek to conquer the other kingdoms of the earth. So even before he's fighting against God or fighting against God's people, he's going to be fighting against the other kingdoms of the earth to get them to sort of buy into his philosophy, to buy into his authority. He's going to try to become a ruler of the entire world. Okay? So the white horse represents what I think is political upheaval. Political upheaval. There's going to be nations that get conquered by other nations and become a part of it. There's going to be like a giant USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. All these other nations are going to get conquered underneath the authority of this one figure, and that is going to be happening in the early days of this 7-year period of time. Then you have the red horse, and this one makes sense because if you have somebody coming who's going to conquer, then it also makes sense that part of that conquering is going to involve war. And this rider, if you take a look down at verse 3 or verse 4, its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth so that people should slay one another, and he was given a great sword. So this represents, down at the bottom there, the 2 blanks, war and murder. War and murder. People are going to be killing each other with great severity and with great regularity. Our world has always known war and people who have taken each other's lives on some level, but it seems like that's going to be ramped up in a major way. This is going to be probably the equivalent of another world struggle, world war. Now, I don't think every nation that's conquered is going to be conquered necessarily at the point of a gun. In fact, I think a lot of these nations are going to realize we can't fight this guy, so we're just going to give in. So there may not be all the bloodshed that will happen later, but there's going to be some parts of the world that resist this political figure who's going to rise up and try to take control of the world. And when that happens, there's going to be fighting, and just in general, there's going to be people slaying one another And so that symbolizes war and murder. So you have conquering, political upheaval, then you have war and murder, and then number 3, the black horse, it says the rider has some scales in his hands. You see that there on verse 5? And its rider had a pair of scales in his hand. Now, the scales is not talking about justice, like the blind lady justice who's got the scales and is innocent or guilty. It's not referring to that. It's referring to when you will buy something in the ancient world, you would buy by weight, right? You would put on the one side of the scale how much bread and how much it weighs, and then you would put on the other side how much money it goes for that, and they would figure out, okay, this is a fair representation of what it is, and that was just a part of the economic processes, in fact it still is around the world, of doing business. Now why do I think it has something to do with doing business? Because in verse 6, the voice cries out, 1 quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine. Well, what's that talking about? It's talking about that during this early days of this 7-year period of time, there is going to be shortages of food. And the cost of food is going to go way through the roof. Now, why does that happen? Is because there's shortages, there's droughts, there's people that are not able to harvest because they're fighting a war, for example. And so what you're going to see is you're going to see a shortage of food, you're going to see famine. That's what those 2 words are there at the bottom of seal number 3. There's going to be famine and shortages, and prices for food are going to dramatically go up. Now, a denarius, just so you know, is roughly about what a common worker would get for working an entire day. So you work the entire day from sun up till sundown. You get paid 1 coin a denarius, and that was supposed to get you through till the next day. So a quart of wheat. Now a quart is not a lot. A quart of wheat is going to cost you an entire day's wage. And 3 quarts of barley will cost you an entire day's wage. Oh, and by the way, the oil and the wine, they're in short supply, so you better not ruin those. You better not waste any of those, because it's going to be expensive to live. There's going to be people that can't afford to buy food. There's going to be famine. There's going to be financial exploitation, just like there always is when there's a shortage, right? They jack up the price so that people can still make money. There's going to be a time while this conquering is going on, while there's war spread out through the entire earth, it makes sense there's going to be a shortage of food, and the people who have what food there is are going to exploit and take advantage of the people who are trying to purchase that. So that's the 3rd horse. It represents famine and shortages. And then you have, of course, the 4th one, and the 4th one is the most obvious of them all because the rider actually gets a name. None of the other riders are named, but this rider is named, verse 8, is a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death. And Hades, that's the place of the dead, was trailing along behind them. And they were given authority over 1/4 of the earth to kill with sword and famine and pestilence and by wild beasts of the earth. I think this is sort of a general, like a summary statement of the first 3, frankly. Because if you have somebody who's going out to conquer and causing political upheaval, there's going to be death. If you have somebody who's starting wars and people are fighting amongst one another, then the most obvious result of that is there are people that are going to die. And then in seal number 3, if there's food shortages and famines, then that means there's even more people are going to die. And it actually, the pale horse, these early days, even though it's not going to be as bad as it's going to get later, there's still 1/4 of the world's population is going to be diminished and taken down by this. So I'm describing this on the bottom there of the blanks as the general death toll of these times, okay? So the general death toll. That's why I think these 4 are meant to be seen as general conditions. Like, it's not like, okay, the political upheaval happens, then war happens, then famine happens, then people die. In fact, the whole thing is intermixed. These 4 seals, I think, are just describing the conditions during these early days. As people are conquering, there's going to be war. As people are fighting wars, there's going to be food shortages. And as there's food shortages and war and political upheaval and people stabbing each other and killing each other and all that stuff, murder is happening, there's going to be a result. 1/4 of the population of the world is going to be destroyed. And it talks about through a variety of ways, right? With the sword, that's fighting. With famine, that's seal number 3, right? With pestilence, now that's disease that also could come because of food shortages and also because of war, right? And wounds and things like that. And then by the wild beasts of the earth. So apparently it's going to get even more dangerous and wild out there, and chaos is going to spread. Think about a fourth of the world's population. I don't know how many people will be alive to start with at this time in human history. If it goes much in the future, it might be even higher. But right now, I think it's 7 billion people on the planet. So we're talking, man, I'm not great at math, but almost 2 billion people. Like 1.6 or 1.7, 1.8 billion people die within a few years. It's gonna be horrific. It's gonna be horrible. Now, one other subpoint I want to make about these 4 seals. These general conditions, here's another blank for you to fill in, are a judgment from God on fallen humanity. They are a judgment from God on fallen humanity. Okay, here's what I mean by that. This is not just God looking down at the planet going, oh, look at what those humans are doing to one another. Boy, I wish they would stop that. They're really causing They're wreaking havoc out there. They're causing destruction and mayhem. You should stop that. This isn't God just observing things happening on earth like he is in some senses now, watching as we're sort of slowly, more slowly than this at least, killing and destroying and having famines and all the same things that are going to happen during this time frame. But it's not even that. It's not even that God is looking down going, wow, Satan is really just running roughshod over the earth. Boy, Satan has really stepped up his attacks. Like, Satan's really making things harder. Boy, Satan's really fighting the battle a lot more, and he's killing way more people than normal. This isn't God looking down at it going, oh man, look at all this stuff going on. This is God actively bringing judgment upon people. I want you to notice a few things. First of all, what is the command that is given to every one of these four riders and horses, right? Before they show up on the scene, one of the 4 living creatures yells out, come, right? He yells out a command that brings them onto the scene of human history. So they're summoned onto the scene because the Lamb has opened a seal and one of the 4 living creatures has commanded that this thing come on the earth. And then if you look at the language in verse 2, did you notice the language in verse 2? It says, its rider had a bow and a crown was given to him. Somebody gave him a crown. And I think it's somebody from the heavenly scene. Like one of the angels or somebody from heaven gives him, or God delegates his authority and says, here, you can have this crown. You can have this authority. All right? And then it says in verse 4. Verse 4. It says, its rider was permitted to take peace from the earth, and he was given a great sword. So he was permitted. Death or war, this warlike figure, armies, are permitted to take life, to take peace away from the earth. And then you look down at verse 8 again. And verse 8 says, I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and its rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him, and they were given authority over a fourth of the earth. Do you see that? God is actively taking part in bringing these events about. This is not just God observing what's already happening down there and going, man, they shouldn't do that. That's really bad. This is God actively moving and allowing forces loose in the world to do evil. Now, this is a tough one. Because some people assume that that means that God is forcing these people and these forces to do evil, right? And so that doesn't seem right. How could God force people to do evil? This isn't that at all. This is God using the evil free choices of evil people and forces to give sinful people judgment that they deserve. Because here's the thing. Evil always wants to unleash havoc on the world. Always. This is what evil does. Satan is described as a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. If Satan had permission, he would kill every single one of us in the slowest, most torturous, painful, destructive way possible. Okay? Satan is not calm. He's not mild. Satan is not somebody who's just minding his own business and then God forced him to do all these bad things. Satan's nature is to desire of his own free will to destroy everything he can possibly do. And the reason Satan doesn't destroy everybody is because God actively has him on a leash. The fact that you're alive today and you've gone through some stuff, okay? I know Satan has attacked each one of you in specific ways and he has tried to damage and destroy you in certain ways. The fact that you're still standing today is because God at one point said to Satan, nope, can't do that, can't go that far, you can't take that away, you can't take that life, you can't go that far. Satan, stop. Stop right there. Now, sometimes God does allow Satan to do what he wants and to some extent, but then God always freezes that. Now, sometimes God allows Satan to take a human life because God has determined that that person's chance to turn around has expired. Now, I don't know why he picks one time for one person and a different time for another. Why does he give one person 20 years and one person 80 years? I don't know that. All I know is that God is the just judge of the universe. God does not push Satan to do evil. Satan always wants to do evil. He always wants to destroy. And God, as a normal thing, is yanking back on the collar of this rabid animal saying, Satan, you cannot destroy this and this and this. And if you do, if I allow you to, it's because I've determined as the judge, that person has used up all their opportunities to change. And so I'm going to unleash Satan to finish that person off and give them the judgment that they deserve. That is sometimes how God judges, okay? So there's a couple of different ways. God is a judge, all right? There's a couple of different ways that God judges. Sometimes God judges by directly punishing himself, right? He does the punishing. Like you think about Sodom and Gomorrah. The story from the book of Genesis. Sodom and Gomorrah was a city with all these people in it, and they were wicked, and God decides, I'm going to come down and check this out. He's got Lot living in there, Lot's wife, he's got 2 daughters, and their husbands, and pretty much those are the only people in the city that are good, that are righteous. Everybody else is wicked, sinful in horrible ways, and deserving of judgment. And so God checks it out, makes sure, and then God rains down sulfur and brimstone on the city, probably some kind of a crazy meteor shower or something, and he just destroys and annihilates the entire city. Sometimes God is the one doing the judging. And in fact, a lot of the judgments that are going to happen from here on out are that. Sometimes, though, God judges by indirectly. He indirectly judges by removing protections that were keeping you from being destroyed. Okay? Romans chapter 1, Paul talks about this. He talks about the fact that when we sinned, or when humanity sinned and chose to worship the creature over the creator, it says God gave them over to certain instincts and certain appetites that ended up destroying them. God didn't judge them with something concrete. He didn't punish them directly. He stepped back, removed his protection, and allowed the natural consequences of your bad choices to destroy you. Okay? So when you have sex with your partner outside of marriage and you have a baby, that baby is not a judgment from God. God is not directly punishing you by giving you a child because of your sinful behavior. In fact, God is removing his protection and saying, you know what? I'm going to allow you to face the natural consequences of your own bad decision, and those consequences will be their own judgment. This here in Revelation chapter 6 seems to be of that second variety. God has been holding Satan back throughout all of human history. And you're like, okay, so the world I live in is a world where God is holding Satan back? Because it sure looks pretty dark and pretty horrible and pretty awful. Yes, God has been restraining Satan, and this is the world that we have. Can you imagine what this world would be like if Satan was unrestrained? Well, if you want to imagine what that world would look like, you need to look at the book of Revelation. Because in the book of Revelation, God pulls his hands back and allows Satan to run roughshod over the earth. And unleashing this powerfully destructive being on the planet with freedom to do what he always wanted to do is going to cause incredible devastation and destruction on the earth. And these early seals are not God dropping fire and brimstone on the people of the earth. It is God indirectly pulling back his restraining of Satan and allowing Satan and human capacities to run roughshod over the earth and destroy and damage through political upheaval, through war, through famine, and then through the general death toll. Does that make sense? So seals 1, 2, 3, and 4 are basically happening at the same time. They're the general conditions of this early era, and it's very chaotic, very destructive, very damaging, a lot of upheaval, a lot of chaos. And God, though, this is a judgment. This is not just God watching us destroying ourselves. This is God pulling back his protection from us and then allowing evil to run unchecked and cause all this damage. So this 1/4 of all of the world's people, this 1/4 of all the world's people that die as a result of normal human consequences of when you allow humans to fight with one another, they end up killing one another, right? The story of Cain and Abel proves that beyond a shadow of a doubt. So that's seals 1, 2, 3, and 4. They're meant to be understood together. These are the general conditions of the early days of the tribulation. When we get to seal number 5, it's going to be a little bit different, and then seal number 6 is going to really be interesting. So we're going to tackle that next time we're together. Thank you for paying attention with me. Next week, instead of me up here, you're going to get a presentation from Brian King, who is the executive director now of the Northeast Fellowship of Churches that we're a part of. And he's going to give you guys a presentation of his ministry. He's going to also be preaching in the morning service on November the 1st. And so he's going to be in charge of this ABF time too. But then the week after that, I'll be back to finish up chapter 6, and then we'll move into Revelation chapter 7 to talk about the rest of these seal judgments and how they affect our understanding of how the story ends. Thank you for your patience. I hope that made sense. If not, hit me up with questions, and I'll do my best to answer them. Love you guys. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.